Hey everyone, this video is on exposure injuries. That is to say, injuries as a result of exposure to extreme heat, cold, and other kinds of environmental conditions. First thing I want to point out is the nature of thermal regulation. We are warm-blooded species. You may have noticed that, maybe in like your fifth grade biology class. Anyways, unlike lizards and snakes, what that means is we maintain and endeavor to maintain a constant body temperature. So if it gets cold out, our body shifts its systemic response in order to address the cold weather. If it's hot out, our body shifts its systemic system in order to shed heat. Basically, we stay right around 98 point something degrees. And if it's hotter than that out, we've got to have a way of releasing excess heat. If it's colder than that, we have to have a way of conserving heat, right? Because we want to stay at that temperature. And we'll talk about exactly how that works. But basically, if you look at the diagram here to the side, you will see that when your body temperature is low, let's say it's cold out, then your hypothalamus stimulates a systemic change to address that cold temperature, if you'd like, to preserve body heat. I don't know what the hell the picture is, by the way, of your hypothalamus. Just to be clear, the hypothalamus is in the brain, right next to the brain, and that picture looks bizarre and nothing like the hypothalamus. But anyways, the effect of trying to preserve core body heat is basically threefold. First, you're going to have your arterial constriction. So basically, your body is going to slow down or restrict flow to your extremities, to your fingers and your toes. We talked about this when we talked about the circulatory system, but this is a way of ensuring that the blood flow doesn't get too cold, because if it does, that cold blood is going to return to your core and start cooling down your core. So by restricting blood flow to your extremities, it's preserving warm, if you'd like, blood in your core. It's also probably going to stimulate shivering, and that's just muscular activity that will generate heat. It's an aerobic process that's going to generate heat. And in fact, shivering can be a sign of, a oncoming cold injury, but the stop of shivering when exposed to cold is even more significant, because what it means is that your thermal regulation system is starting to break down. And the thyroid can also stimulate cells that increase the metabolic heat production. On the other hand, if your body is exposed to excess heat, the hypothalamus notices that, and it's actually going to dilate your vessels to allow more blood to flow to your extremities. So basically, blood here is functioning as like the coolant in your engine. It's going to go to the extremities, and your fingers and toes are going to act as radiators. They're going to radiate out some of that heat, allowing your blood to shed heat and maintain a constant core temperature. In addition to that, to help with the shedding of heat, it's going to stimulate sweating in your skin. And what's going to happen is that fluid that comes out of your skin, that sweat, is going to evaporate. And as it does evaporate, it's going to take away heat from your body. You might remember that when a fluid changes states, when something changes like sweat, for example, from a liquid state to a vapor state, it absorbs a lot of heat energy from its surroundings. That's what's happening here, is the sweat is vaporizing, it's evaporating, and when it does, it absorbs heat energy from your body. So the blood, now very near the surface of your skin, is going to shed heat in that way and be cooler as it returns to your core and keep your core from getting too hot. That's basically the systemic response that we need to think about. Now, how is heat moving into or out of your body? Basically, one of four ways. Radiation. You've probably noticed this if you're under the sun, and the sun keeps you remarkably warm. In fact, you can go on a really cold day. If it's a sunny day, you're going to feel probably more comfortable as a result of the radiation. That is heat moving not with the air, but through space. And in fact, you should recognize this, because literally in this case, space, that is to say, everything on the Earth is radiating heat into outer space. And this is the reason why, for example, if you're out backpacking and you put, say, a tarp just hanging over you, keep the sides open, not a tent, but just a tarp hanging over you, and you sleep under that tarp, you will stay somewhat warmer, because that tarp will stop some of the radiation, some of your heat from radiating into outer space. So we gain and lose heat through radiation. In addition, conduction. Conduction is heat moving through a solid object. So you may have noticed, as an example of this, that if it's cool out and you sit on a metal park bench, it feels really cold. If you sit on a wood park bench, it feels warmer. The two benches are the same temperature. The difference is the metal is better at conducting heat away from your body. So you sit on that metal bench and it is conducting the heat away from your body. You sit on the wood bench, it's not so good at conduction, so you're not losing as much heat. So the metal bench feels colder, but it's actually the same temperature. In terms of backpacking, the hint here is that means that the earth can also conduct heat away from you. So when you are sleeping and want to stay warm, it's super important to have a bed sleeping pad. People often spend a lot of money on a fancy sleeping bag and get a crappy pad. This is terrible logic, because the way you're going to lose a lot of heat when you're sleeping in the backcountry is by conducting that heat into the earth when you're laying your whole body prone down on the earth. So the way to stop that is to put an insulator between you and the earth. And that's what a good sleeping pad does. So you want to invest in a really good sleeping bag, but you also want to invest in a really good sleeping pad. Convection is the other possibility. Convection is heat carried with the air. So when you're standing around a fire, that fire is radiating heat toward you, but also it's heating air, and that air is bringing heat to you as well. That is why, for example, you'll be colder when it's windy outside, because the wind is carrying away heat from your body. That is the process of convection. And we already talked about evaporation. In particular, as you sweat, you'll get colder because that sweat will evaporate. And as it does, it will absorb more energy in the process of changing from liquid to vapor. It doesn't change temperature. The temperature is the same, but it vaporizes, and that absorbs heat from its surrounding and will also cool you down quite a bit. You've probably noticed that because on a hot day, you jump into a pool. When you jump out of the pool, you feel cooler, in part because the water is conducting heat away from you, but also when you step out of the pool, what water is left on you evaporates, and that cools you down. All of this happens at the same time. So when you're out running, hiking, doing whatever you're doing, your body is constantly adjusting its systemic response to the environment to maintain your body temperature. So it's constantly constricting or dilating vessels, sweating or not sweating, to adapt to radiation. And you are radiating out to space, but also radiation is coming into you, or heat radiation is coming into you. You are conducting out, but also conduction is happening in. And the thing I didn't mention is you're also breathing. And as you breathe, you are also conducting heat out into the environment, or absorbing heat in if it's a very hot day. So your body's addressing all of this. So to be clear, what we've got then is vasodilation. We already talked about the circulatory system, so that should make sense. And as the body cools, perspiration allows basically vasodilation to be more effective at shedding heat. And vasoconstriction is meant to maintain your core temperature. All of this is really about maintaining core temperature. So your body is willing to sacrifice a finger or a toe for the sake of preserving the core temperature of your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, and all your brain, and all the other things that you need to continue functioning. Basically, your body's figuring, I don't really need those fingers, but I really need that heart to keep functioning. So I'm going to maintain the heart temperature. Okay, that's your core temperature then. In this case, it's in degrees centigrade, but you can see that it's basically the same kind of idea. And what this, by the way, implies is really interesting, but people don't often think about it. And that is, often your core body temperature can get cold because your extremities are cold. So your extremities, if you're active, may not even feel cold. But your core temperature will plummet a little bit because you are active. And so you're forcing your body to maintain active circulation, which means you're forcing your body to keep blood going to your extremities, but your extremities are warm because they're getting warm blood from the core, but they're losing that heat. They're shedding that heat, so your core stops dropping. The lesson then is, if your hands are cold, put on a hat. Because if you can help your body maintain core temperature while it really matters, then it will be better able to actually provide blood flow to your extremities that will keep you warmer. And what it really means is plan and be responsible and respond to your environment. If you're going into a cold environment, don't think, oh, I can take it. This is no big deal. I can handle the cold. I don't mind being cold. This is a threat and a challenge to your body. So you've got to make sure that you can help your body adapt to this environmental challenge by putting on proper clothes. Dry clothes, clean clothes, and appropriate clothes. At this point, you're thinking, Hasse, why clean? Because dirty clothes are also oily clothes. They have body oils on them. And the advantage of your clothes is insulation. And insulation doesn't come from the fabric. It comes from the fabric's ability to trap air. And if the fabric is matted down by body oils, then it won't trap air as well, and it won't be such a good insulator. So a clean sweater can be a great insulator. A dirty sweater is not as good of an insulator. Okay, what kind of cold injuries are we talking about? Well, I want to cover briefly hypothermia, chronic and acute, and also frostbite and frost nip. So chronic hypothermia I want to talk about first because people don't often realize it's a possibility. Please realize that you can become hypothermic. And here, let me stop and talk about vocabulary. Hypo, we know what that means, low thermic temperature. Hypothermic means low core temperature. You can become hypothermic in temperatures as warm as 50 degrees over a long period because your body will endeavor to maintain your constant body temperature. And if you are active, again, if you're out there hiking, your body doesn't have the option to slow blood flow to your extremities because you are requiring it to maintain blood flow to your extremities, which means that over a longer period, especially if it's wet out and it's maybe cool, let's say 45 degrees, even if you're not feeling it, you can drop your core body temperature gradually. Doesn't need to be freezing. Being in great physical shape, proper nutrition, all of this can help. Proper clothing is key. But the reality is that even if you're in good shape, even if you're in great shape, you can still cause injury by not paying attention to and being prepared for the weather. And you can even actually drive yourself into shock, which is a pretty serious condition. So you want to be aware of that, particularly in cool conditions where you don't have appropriate clothing. Severe hypothermia is a little bit different. And hypothermia is basically broken down into three categories. Mild, which is 90 to 95 degrees. Notice that the upper end of mild is 95 degrees. So if your core temperature drops to 97 degrees, that's considered normal. People think that 98 point whatever, and I keep saying 98 point whatever because I don't want you to fixate on a particular number. Your body is not that precise. So if you take your temperature and it's 97.8, that is a normal temperature. If you take your temperature and it's 99.1, that's a normal temperature. We're looking for the range of normal temperature. Once your temperature drops down below 95, now we have abnormal temperature. And you're probably going to notice things like shivering, possibly slurred speech. And what you want to do then is allow yourself to passively rewarm or allow the victim to passively rewarm. And I'll talk about what I mean by passive rewarming in a second. Moderate hypothermia is 82 to 90 degrees. I know 82 is kind of weird as a number, but it's 82 because below 82 degrees, the body starts to respond in particular ways that makes it a severe threat to life. Moderate hypothermia can be significant. It can lead to cognitive disorientation. Somebody might get apathetic. They might get super comfortable. They might think, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. They might be argumentative. You might lose consciousness, actually, and mistake the loss of consciousness in an individual for sleep. So you want to pay really close attention to this. In most cases, the person will be able to rewarm passively, but they may require active rewarming. And again, I'll describe that in a second. Severe hypothermia is below 82 degrees. Severe hypothermia is actually the position, the point where your core temperature is so low, it may trigger a cardiac response called ventricular fibrillation. We talked about this when we talked about circulation, and we're going to talk about this in the CPR portion of the class. But basically what that means is instead of your heart beating in normal beating, it's just quivering. And that means you're not getting adequate circulation. That means not adequate perfusion. That means you're getting closer to death. And that's a real problem. It needs to be addressed immediately. The body can be rigid. The body can be non-responsive. Are you dead? No. The victim is not dead at 80 degrees or 75 degrees. In fact, One important lesson here about hypothermia is that the body can respond to, adapt to, and recover from hypothermia in remarkable ways. So never, ever, 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 ever presume your victim is dead just because they are cold and or stiff. Okay, I talked about passive and active. What did I mean by that? Well, passive heating, reheating, means allowing the body to rewarm itself. The body still has the capacity to generate heat by burning fuel, and so allow the body to do that. So what do you want to do in a passive reheating? First, you want to strip off all wet clothing. Wet clothing is way worse than no clothing. Dry, clean clothing is the best. But if somebody's in wet clothes, don't make the mistake to think, oh, well, we don't want to, take off all their clothes because they'll be worse off naked. Nope, they'll be better off naked. That doesn't mean you leave them naked. Take off the wet clothing, put on some dry clothing, conserve their heat, get them into a warmer environment, and allow the body to reheat. It's really important in these situations to avoid rapid rewarming. Rapid rewarming can cause tissue damage, and it can be extremely painful. You've probably noticed even this if you've been out, let's say, in the cold and you allowed your hands to get too cold, you had a little bit of frost nip, and then you figure, okay, I'm going to warm them back up, and you put them under warm water. That hurts like hell. It's necessary. You got to warm your fingers back up, but it really hurts. Imagine that over your entire body. Not awesome. If somebody's in a more serious scenario where their body may not be able to rewarm itself, you need to then use active rewarming. Maybe they have moderate or even severe hypothermia. Active rewarming means you're applying warmth to the body. It has to be modest warmth. You don't want to warm the body up too quickly. It can create shock and create tissue damage, so modest warmth. This may mean bringing them into a very warm environment. It may mean in a backcountry scenario, huddling next to them. An ideal way to warm somebody back up is to take off their clothes and put them between two warm bodies in a sleeping bag. And believe me, you might think, well, I don't want to do that with my hiking members. Yeah, I went through Marine Corps survival training, and we were super cuddly when it got warm, when it got cold at night. So I can tell you, in the middle of the night, Marines or not, we were cuddling real close together when the temperature got down into the 20s, and we were trying to stay warm. So, get over it and keep each other warm. Here's the things you want to avoid. You want to avoid jostling the person, especially if they're very cold. This can create a cardiac response that might actually throw them into cardiac arrest. You want to avoid rubbing extremities. You're not going to really generate any heat through friction in a useful way, and you can create significant tissue damage. And you will want to avoid warm or hot drinks. So don't give them the hot chocolate, don't give them the coffee, don't give them the tea. The reason for that is because they've possibly lost their ability to swallow, and they've probably lost their ability to sense heat. So they're going to drink down that hot chocolate perhaps too fast and actually burn themselves. So some modestly warm liquid, if the person is certainly capable of swallowing, is okay, but nothing hot by mouth until they've passively or actively rewarmed in a gradual, modest way. You also want to avoid what's called after drop. See, one thing that can happen here, remember I talked about, like, if you're outside and active, you're forcing your body to maintain circulation, which can cool your core. Okay, imagine this scenario. Somebody is in a hypothermic state, so their core is now cooled and their extremities are even colder. And you say, because you haven't had this class and you're not paying attention, you say, hey, warm yourself up by jogging in place. You're now forcing their body to actively circulate blood, and their core drops even more. This is what's called after drop, and that can be extremely dangerous. So you want to control circulation, move them gently, move them slowly. Don't allow themselves to exert themselves, right? Passively and slowly rewarm them. If they've gotten very cold, and their heart has stopped, you need to apply CPR. This is a little tricky because I just mentioned, don't jostle them. So applying CPR with chest compressions could actually throw them into perhaps ventricular fibrillation, but you've got no choice. You've got to apply CPR. For how long? until they are warm. No one is cold and dead. If they are still cold, they're not dead, and you should not consider them dead until they are warm and dead. So you begin warming, you begin CPR, and you continue CPR until their core temperature is at least above 86 degrees. Their core temperature, not thermometer by mouth, their core temperature is above 86 degrees. And if that takes an hour, you do chest compressions for an hour. If it takes 2 hours, you do chest compressions for 2 hours. You do chest compressions until they are warm and dead. And people actually come back. You can have somebody whose pulse is imperceptible and provide CPR for like 90 minutes, and they will come back if their core temperature has dropped. So this is not normal. If you find somebody on the side of the road and they need CPR and you're doing 90 minutes of CPR, they're probably gone. But if they've been submerged or under ice or in a very cold environment, they're not dead until they're warm and dead. Okay. You can first begin with applied rescue breaths if you got somebody in extreme cold, because it could be that their respiration is stopped, respiratory arrest, and so you need to get some oxygen in their lungs first. And again, those chest compressions can trigger VFib, so you want to be concerned for that. But you may have no choice but to provide chest compressions. Apply rescue breaths first. This is unusual in CPR. Rescue breaths first, and their heart may spontaneously start. And you may start at the jugular, feeling a modest pulse. If you do, CPR is not necessary and it's potentially dangerous. If you don't, and there is no pulse, you have no choice but to begin CPR. Okay, frostbite, frost nips. Frost nip is basically a modest version of frostbite. So it's where your outside dermal layer is frozen. And so you can have a little bit of tissue damage, which will result in sort of dryness in your skin. That kind of thing is not too serious. Frostbite can be much more serious because frostbite can entail deep tissue freezing and damage as a result of loss of perfusion. So two things are happening. One is your skin tissue is freezing. So the water in your skin tissue is crystallizing and causing tissue damage. And the other is that same tissue is suffering from lack of perfusion because blood is not getting out to the extremity because of the cold, right? So superficial frostbite, frostbite has different levels to it. So superficial frostbite, generally you should thaw it as soon as you can. The longer the tissue is allowed to be frozen, the greater or more severe the damage is. Full thickness frostbite, generally you've got an extremity or tissue that is hard to the touch, that's not bendable. The extremity, the fingers may not be bendable because the tissue is just too solid. You need to get that person to immediate medical care. Here's some trickiness to this if you'd like. Oh, first off, to do this, you can actually submerge them in lukewarm water, like 100-degree water, not 105 degree, not 110 degree, then it starts to get too warm. So if you're thinking about this in terms of temperature, like the temperature of a really hot shower is way too hot. The temperature of a warm shower, 100 degrees, is the temperature that you want. Gradual rewarming that allows perfusion to reshape. This is going to be painful, but you've got to do it until the skin is warm and pink or red. And it's going to hurt like a son of a gun, but it's necessary. Here's the thing. This is the point I was going to get to before. You'd never, ever, ever want to thaw an area and then allow it to refreeze. So you need to be careful about this. If you're going to thaw somebody's extremity when they're suffering from frostbite and you're not sure that you can stop it from refreezing, you should not be thawing it. This includes yourself. So imagine this scenario. You get lost in the woods and it's extremely cold. You pass out. When you wake up, your left leg is no longer mobile. It's frozen solid, literally frozen solid. You've got deep tissue frostbite. You could start a fire and possibly thaw out your leg, which normally would be a really good idea because the longer that leg stays frozen, the more tissue damage. But if nobody knows where you're at if there's no rescue coming, this could be a bad idea, because once you thaw your leg, you're then going to need to hike out. And if that leg refreezes as a result of its deteriorated condition because of the frostbite, then the damage will be far worse. Or the pain could be so great that you won't be able to hike out. So there are scenarios where you may want to delay the thawing of a frozen appendage in order to allow yourself to self-rescue. This is only true in a self-rescue scenario. And the real truth, if you're only going to remember one thing, remember this: the longer the tissue is frozen, the greater the damage. So you want to gradually and modestly thaw any tissue from frostbite as soon as you can. That's the serious lesson. But in a particular scenario where you need a self-rescue, you may want to delay that process. Submersion. Basically, the other way somebody can get themselves very, very cold is by submerging themselves in something that's very, very cold, because conduction will then take the heat away from them. So the water does not need to be near freezing in order to cause hypothermia. First thing you want to start with in that scenario is rescue breaths for sure. There's really no or little value in trying to remove water from the lungs. It used to be the case that in first aid, people used to get trained to, and we used to do this crazy thing where we kind of like do a Heimlich while they're facing downward to get water out of the lungs. Doesn't work. And there's hopefully enough alveoli available in the lungs to allow for some respiration. So basically provide some rescue breaths, make sure that their lungs have some air in them, and then if necessary, begin CPR. And again, just to make the point, do not presume they are dead. The body's metabolism slows down when it's cold. If they were in very cold water submerged for 15 minutes, I can't hold my breath for 15 minutes. You can't hold your breath for 15 minutes. They may still be alive. 20 minutes, may still be alive. So you want to actually provide full CPR for anybody who pulled out of a cold submerged scenario until they are, you guessed it, warm and dead. Nobody is cold and dead. Okay, the other kinds of environmental threats we might face is from heat. And one thing people often don't recognize when they go into high heat conditions is that also takes adaptation. You need to allow your body to take some time to get used to a warmer climate. So if it's the middle of winter and you think it's going to be awesome, I'm going to go out to Texas and do some hiking. If it's warm in Texas, that's awesome, but allow your body to adapt to that. And it may take an individual up to 10 days to adapt to a high heat situation. So don't schedule that desert hike the day after you fly into Arizona. You want to give your body some time to adapt to the temperature before you go out there. In these high temperatures, one possible heat injury is dehydration, and the other is hyperthermia. Notice the medical terminology now. Hyper, we know what that means. It means high. Thermia, we can guess what that means. So high core temperature. And dehydration means that we have lost adequate hydration, so our body has inadequate amount of water available. Okay, let's talk about those. First, dehydration. What are the typical symptoms? Well, it can begin with things like confusion. You might actually get, I didn't put it here, I forgot about it, tachycardia. So that's, remember what tachycardia is? It means fast heart rate. So if you got modest, even just modest dehydration, you might feel your heart starting to race. You might get dizziness, lightheadedness, headache, tiredness, confusion. One thing you're probably going to notice, especially with chronic dehydration, is you're not going to pee as much. So the way to avoid this, drink plenty of fluid and check your urine. I know this sounds crazy. When you're out hiking, and I know women, this is a little tougher for you, but make the effort. Look at your urine as it's coming out of your body and make sure that it is clear and plentiful. When you're peeing, you should be peeing clear urine and peeing large amounts of urine. Keep the fluid flowing through you. If you're having only modest amounts of peeing, or if the pee is a dark yellow or worse, a brown color, these are bad signs. You don't want that. So you want to drink enough fluid to keep that going. Okay, having said that, let me get on a little bit of a segue here to the side and say, sometimes athletes get carried away and they overhydrate, and that can be a risk too. Here's an interesting little factoid. In the Boston Marathon, Not a single athlete has ever suffered and died from dehydration, but several have died from overhydration. What happens is you've taken so much fluid that you basically dilute the sodium in your system, and now your system is actually unable to function properly because you don't have enough sodium available. So don't get too carried away if you're an athlete and you're thinking hydration is always good. Your body will generally be pretty good at telling you when it needs fluid. That doesn't mean you always wait for severe thirst. Go ahead and sip and drink as you're going. But if you're out there running or if you're out there hiking, don't think the more you drink, the better. Drink an adequate and reasonable amount to allow your body to continue processing fluid, allow your system to continue to function. And how do you know it's the right amount? Because you're peeing and your pee is clear. Okay. So I already pointed out, don't rely on thirst. Your thirst is a little bit of a laggard, so you'll get thirsty after you're already getting dehydrated. So kind of stay ahead of it a little bit. It's better to sip in small amounts throughout the day. Having said that, there are plenty of people, literally plenty of people who have died of dehydration while being lost in the wilderness, and they still had water available. Why could they be so foolish? Because people have the mistaken idea that they need to preserve water and take tiny little sips and make sure that they make the water last. So let me make this clear. The best canteen for your water is your body. If you're thirsty, drink. Your body will manage the water adequately. Don't try to second guess your body. It will know how to manage the water. Give it the water it's asking for. Okay. If you do get dehydrated, or more likely, if you run across somebody who gets dehydrated, what do? Rehydrate them. Give them water. Water is great at hydrating, folks. It doesn't necessarily need to be Gatorade. It doesn't need to be anything fancy. Water's great. Having said that, if you can provide some electrolytes, that can be desirable in certain situations of dehydration as well. Gatorade tends to be a little heavy on the electrolytes, so something like a 50-50 mix of Gatorade and water is probably the ideal scenario for somebody who's dehydrated. What I do is I keep basically those little tubes of Gatorade mix in my first aid kit, and so I'll take a full 500 milliliter bottle and mix it up. And I can tell you that I have run across so many people that are acutely and seriously dehydrated while hiking, especially in the Southwest, that I now bring, well, I used to when I led trips to the Southwest, I brought about 10 of those tubes on hikes. And I think that on every single hike I went on, I came back with no tubes because I just run across hikers, half passed out, dizzy on the side of the trail that I'd have to sort of rehydrate before I continued on with my hike. People generally underestimate the amount of fluid they're going to need for their body. Okay, another possibility that's out there is heat exhaustion. Heat exhaustion is pretty serious. Basically, heat exhaustion is that your body dilates vessels in order to move heat away from the core and increases sweating as well. We talked about this. However, if it's doing this, the results can be a drop in blood pressure, because basically what's happening is your vessels are opening up now, right? Which means you're creating, we talked about this when we talked about the circulatory system like a hydraulic system, you're creating more space, but you still have the same amount of fluid. And as a result of that, the pressure goes down. So you might see a drop in blood pressure, and this is an indication of heat exhaustion. Symptoms of this can be headache, weakness, nausea. Nausea almost always comes with heat-related illnesses. So if somebody starts getting nauseous, you can probably think that they are actually experiencing the effect of heat. A rapid pulse, again, tachycardia is common with heat exhaustion. And usually, again, a mild disorientation. So maybe confusion, argumentative. Maybe they think they're doing fine, except they're clearly super sweaty and not walking a straight line. What do you do in this case? You cool them down. And here's the good news. You don't need to be as careful as you do with hypothermia. What I mean is it's okay to cool them down fast. So if you got enough water, pour some water over their head. Spray them with water. Fan them off. Obviously have them drink. Maybe wet down a bandana and put it over their head and then pour water over that. So the bandana will keep that cool water on their head. If there's a pond around, a pool, anything like that, go ahead and get them in water. Go ahead and cool them down actively. This may take, by the way, more than a few hours to do, but you want to keep cooling them until their core body temperature has gone back into the normal range. Heat stroke is basically that, only more severe. At this point, the body has lost its ability to regulate core temperature. So now you'll notice the body is no longer sweating. So basically, the body isn't functioning properly, the thermoregulatory system is out of whack, and the person has stopped sweating. When we talked about hypothermia, I forgot to mention this. One sign of severe hypothermia, or even mild hypothermia, but deteriorated hypothermia, is the body stops shivering. The same thing kind of happens. The thermoregulatory system fails, so the body stops shivering. That's a bad sign if the person's still cold. In this case, if a person stops sweating and they're hot, and they can be up to 105 degrees or hotter. I don't mean it's 105 degrees outside. I mean their body temperature is 105 degrees. That is a severe life threat. What kind of symptoms are we going to see? We might see poor muscle control called ataxia. So maybe they're unable to kind of move themselves. Maybe they've lost coordination. Maybe they're slurring their speech. Tachycardia is almost a certainty. So their heart is now pumping really hard. Why is their heart pumping so hard? Because their blood pressure has dropped. Remember, we talked about that. As a response, the heart starts pumping rapidly to deal with this. Their skin is going to be red and hot. This is a really bad sign. This is a life-threatening scenario. You need to cool them off immediately. If you need to, whatever you need to do to cool their body off, do that. So in this case, if you've got muddy, filthy pool water or muddy, filthy pond of a little pond of sumpy, green, icky water that you normally wouldn't even touch, go ahead and put them in that. Yeah, there's a risk of infection. The infection is not as great of a threat as the heat is. So go ahead and douse them in that water. Don't drink it, but pour it all over their body. Cool them down any way you can. The person's likely to be uncooperative. They're often going to be confused, maybe belligerent. This is actually a sign of heat stroke. This is confirming the fact that they are going into heat stroke. Cool them off any way you can, with special focus on the neck, armpits, groin, those areas closest to the core. You want to cool down that core temperature. And again, immersion is the best way to do that, if at all possible. Okay, so basically we're dealing with heat stroke and heat exhaustion. This can be super serious. We can be looking at temperatures 103, 104, 105 degrees. This is, life-threatening and can lead to unstable heart rates, can lead to the need for CPR. So we want to deal with that before it becomes life-threatening. Look for the early signs. Okay, another way heat can hurt you, well, it can burn you. And so let's talk about burns a little bit. Basically, burns are broken down into 3 levels. It used to be first, second, and third degree burns, but it turns out in medicine, all kinds of shit is first, second, and third degree, and it gets just too confusing, or type 1, type 2, type 3. Doctors love to number things 1, 2, 3, so it was hard to remember. So now there's a much easier way to remember it. We talk about superficial burns, which is a burn just to the superficial dermal layer, partial thickness burn, which is a burn to the dermal layer and then a little bit of the tissue beneath it, and full thickness burn, which is a burn all the way down to the subcutaneous layer. Now, just knowing that, you're already kind of an expert, because you could probably look at a burn and imagine pretty easily how deep it goes. So that image there on your left, that is a full thickness burn, that where skin, that's what that grid work is. Skin is being regrafted onto the spot. So basically all the skin tissue, all the dermal tissue was completely burned off. On the right is a superficial burn. If you're wondering what a superficial burn feels like, just think of your last sunburn. That was a superficial burn. A radiation burn, of course, was a superficial burn. Are we concerned about superficial burns? Generally, no, but if they cover more than 50% of your body, then they can actually affect your thermoregulation. So if you've got a severe sunburn over half of your body, that can be a problem. Basically, when we decide on the severity of a burn, we're going to look at 2 things. We're going to look at whether it's superficial, partial, or full thickness. That's one thing. And the other thing we're going to look at is how much of the body it covers. And I'll explain how we estimate that in a bit. So to be clear here, superficial burns. red skin, no blisters, sunburn. Partial thickness burn starts to blister. The skin is damaged, can be very red, probably the most painful type of burn. Why? Because your skin is designed to take pain and send those signals to your brain. So when you cause damage to those pain receptors, they're really good at sending that signal to your brain, which leads to a full thickness burn. A full thickness burn, where it's full thickness, tends not to be painful because all those pain receptors are now completely destroyed. Generally, the color here can be pale white, it can be a charred color, and there can be no pain. It's really a deep tissue kind of burn. Realize, though, that you never have a full thickness burn that's just a full thickness burn, because wherever there's a full thickness burn, around it is a partial thickness burn, and around that is a superficial burn. We call that the bullseye burn pattern. So all burns are going to be painful, because even if the third degree or the full thickness part isn't painful, the rest of it surrounding it will be painful, often severely painful. What do you do for burns? Number one, the first thing you want to remember, the thing you always want to do, is stop the burning process. That might sound obvious, but I don't just mean like drop the thing that's on fire. I mean douse for many minutes the area in cool, clean water, because the tissue will still be deteriorating. It will still be hot many minutes after the heat has been applied. So you're cooking over a campfire, you grab a pan, didn't realize it was hot, you burned your hand. You've pulled your hand away from the pan. That your hand is no longer touching the pan, but it's still burning because the tissue is still hot. You heated it up and it's still hot. You need to stop the burning process. You need to pour water over that burn for 5 or 10 minutes at least to cool it down. If there's a creek nearby, go ahead and just submerge in the creek and hang out there for 20 minutes. Once you've done that, clean the area thoroughly, because there's always the risk of infection. Do not aggressively start what we call the debriding the area. Don't start pulling off dead tissue. Don't start pulling crud out of the burn. You're just going to create a lot of tissue damage. You don't want to do that. If there's blisters, resist the urge to pop them. Let the blisters heal on their own. Remove any jewelry. So that means in the extremity, the area distal to the burn. So if you've got a burn here on your arm, remove any jewelry on the hand, because the whole arm is going to start swelling up, and the damage done by that jewelry could be worse than the damage from the burn. So immediately remove any jewelry. There's something called second skin dressing, which is great for burn. If you have a dressing in your first aid kit that is designed for burns, go ahead and apply that. If you do not have a dressing that's designed for burns, then don't apply dressing. And after you've stopped the burning process by pouring water over it, submerging it for a good 15 or 20 minutes, let it dry and keep it dry. One risk that happens is people will apply dressing, and often because it makes the burn feel better, they will wet that dressing down. And in fact, I was trained to do that as an EMT way back in the 80s. What happens is the tissue, the skin gets all mucky and mushy, and then the gauze gets caught into the skin, and it all becomes entangled together. And when you finally get them to the hospital for care, the physicians have a hell of a time tearing this tissue out of this mucky, mushed up, mushy gauze and fiber, and it just becomes a terrible mess. So you don't want to put somebody through that. If you don't have the dressing that is designed for burns, then it may be better simply not to dress the burn. Having said that, I'm talking about a serious burn here. If you got a mild, very mild first degree burn, or superficial burn, or maybe just a slight partial tissue burn, go ahead and put a bandage on that. Go ahead and put some antibiotic ointment on that to keep the air off of it so it doesn't burn. I'm talking about a serious burn. The other thing to think about with burns is, just like other heat injuries, it really messes with your thermal regulation. So one risk of burns is that you could go into shock because your body's thermal regulatory system is way out of whack. And the person could suffer from dehydration for the same reason. Basically, your skin is designed to help manage your body's temperature, you know that, and also to help encase all the fluid in your body. When the skin is destroyed, both of those things become risky. So provide somebody with fluids, plenty of fluids, ideally something like a 50-50 mix of Gatorade or whatever, electrolyte drink. If you don't have that, it doesn't have to be basically something designed for rehydration, by the way. Powdered Tang or lemonade or iced tea is perfectly fine too. And if you don't have any of those, just water, maybe with just a sprinkle of salt in it and maybe a sprinkle of baking soda if you happen to have that. But I would think that when you're in the backcountry, probably more likely to have powdered lemonade than to have baking soda. But anyways, go ahead and toss just a little sprinkle of that into the water if you've got it. And then if you want to ease the pain, the best possible option is ibuprofen. So you want to keep ibuprofen in your first aid kit for that reason. If ibuprofen is likely to make their nausea worse, because nausea can often be associated with heat injuries, then you may want to think about Tylenol, acetaminophen as an option. Okay, again, now, if it's a modest burn, apply an antibiotic ointment. That's great to help avoid any kind of further damage from infection. If you do not have an ointment appropriate for a burn and you don't have a dressing appropriate for a burn, then don't dress it. The burn will develop a scab-like covering to it, and that will provide pretty good protection against continued damage. One thing you can do, by the way, if you happen to have it, is put cellophane. Cellophane is a great burn dressing. So if you got a burn on the arm and you happen to have some cellophane, I don't know why you'd have cellophane unless you thought to bring it. And cellophane is really hard to carry in a first aid kit. Believe me, I've tried. But if you can bring a small roll of cellophane, it's great for wrapping around burns because it won't stick to the tissue and it won't make the tissue all goopy. It'll be able to be peeled off. Notice that there you've got an image of how cellophane can be put on a burn, and notice that that burn has a mark, or that I'm sure that bandage has a mark on the outside showing the periphery of the burn so that we can see if the damage, the tissue damage, is continuing after the burn is dressed. Okay, don't apply ice to the burn. It might make it feel a little better. Once you've got it wrapped, if you've got it wrapped in a non-inclusive dressing, that is, if you've got it wrapped in some appropriate burn dressing that won't allow air or moisture to contaminate the wound, then you can apply a cool compress on the outside to keep the area cool to help with the pain. But otherwise, don't apply ice. Freezing the tissue is not going to be good for it, and the added moisture is not going to be good for it. And again, remember, thermal regulation is compromised, so get the person in a blanket. I know that sounds crazy. It may not have been that cold out, but their body may have lost the ability to regulate temperature. So unless it's really hot out, get a space blanket around them, get a blanket around them, help them manage their core temperature because their body's not going to be able to do it on its own. Okay. If evacuation is delayed, if you're a few days out, you want to redress the injury. So if you've got a burn injury, normally you put a dressing on, you leave it on. But if it's going to be a couple of days or more, then you may want to, a couple of times a day, remove the dressing, just cleanse off the wound, no aggressive debridement, no scrubbing, cleanse off the wound, let it dry, and then apply a burn or antibiotic ointment if you have one, and reapply the dressing. If you don't have appropriate dressing, if you don't have appropriate ointment, then don't redress. Leave it wrapped, leave it untouched. If you're going to get to definitive medical care within a day or so, don't mess with the dressing. Put the dressing on and leave it on. The other thing you need to do is you need to estimate the severity of the situation. We talked about this before. Basically, in order to know how urgently you need to get to this person in medical care, you need to know how severe the injury is. And I remember I described to you one aspect of that is how bad the burn is. The other aspect of that is how much of the body's burned. And in order to estimate that, we use total body surface area, or TBSA. Now, here's the thing. For adults, it's really easy. Basically, we use two ways of doing this. One is that the palm of the victim is 1% of their body area. Not your palm, their palm. So if they're smaller, it's going to be a smaller palm. If they're bigger, it's going to be a bigger palm. You get it? Right. So if they've got a wound, a burn on their chest, look at their palm and then estimate. That burn looks to be the size of 5 of their palms. Then it's 5% of their body area. If it's multiple burn spots, add them all up. The other possibility is the rule of nines. And the rule of nines is pretty easy too. It says that your total head is 9% of your body. Your arms are 9% of your body, 4.5% for the front, 4.5% for the back. Your trunk is 18%, 2 times 9 on the front and the same on the back. Your legs are 9% on the front, 9% on the back. So each leg total is 18%. If you remember that, and it's not hard to remember, you can now say, okay, I've got a victim where both arms are burned, but only half, only the front of the arm. That's 4.5% on each arm because it's half of 9%. So that's 9% total. Or I've got a victim where one leg is circumferentially burned all the way around. Okay, that's 9 for the front, 9 for the back. That's 18%. So it's pretty easy math to do. And you might ask yourself, why do you need to know this? Because you are in a world of cell phones and satellite phones going to be contacting medical care. And that's one of the first things they're going to ask, because they're going to use that to determine how serious it is, because they need to figure out, can this person be carried out or do they need to send a helicopter? Now, here's some indications where you need to get a helicopter. So basically, this is when the situation is so severe that you need to get them out as quickly as possible. If that means get them on a stretcher and hike them out, then that's what you do. If that means calling in a helicopter, that's what you do. But you need to get them to care as soon as possible. First, if they're burned and having trouble breathing, that's a serious indication of a problem. If you have a partial or full thickness burn that's more than 10% of the patient's total body surface area, that's an indication of a real problem. Or if the burn is circumferential, if it's all the way around a body part. So if you've burned the entirety all the way around the body part, they need to get medical care quickly because it's going to be hard for the body to repair that injury. Or if the hands, face, genital, or feet are injured. And you might say, why is that so serious? Because it's going to affect the rest of their life. Unless they get immediate medical care, they may not be able to use that hand in the future, or that foot, or that penis. And those are pretty serious concerns for most people, right? So you want to make sure that if their genitals, hands, or major joints, shoulders, circumferential burn all the way around the shoulder, that's a real problem. You want to get them to definitive medical care as soon as possible. If it's a full thickness burn, not a partial thickness burn, but a full thickness burn that covers 5% of their body, so 5 times the size of their palm, that is a serious burn as well that needs immediate care. If it's a burn caused by chemicals, explosions, electricity, that may need immediate care. And in kids younger than 5 or greater than 60, cut those numbers in half. So it's no longer 10%, it's 5%. Right? Okay. The other way you're going to get burned in a wildlife scenario is lightning strikes. So here's some things to think about. First, if you're in a lightning scenario and you're afraid of getting struck, get away from stuff that's tall. Get in cover if you can. And if you can't, the best position you could be in is on your toes and crouch down. Crouch down because you're lower than things around you. Lightning is going to find the easiest route to the earth, and you aren't the easiest route because you're further away. And on your toes because you've got your shoes there providing some insulation from the earth, so therefore you're not a good conductor. If somebody gets struck by lightning and they're screaming in pain, they're out of immediate danger. They may be injured. You need to deal with the trauma, don't get me wrong. But the real concern with a lightning strike is it will stop their heart or kill them immediately. So if they are feeling pain and expressing that pain, then you know that what you've got now is a trauma injury. Having said that, lightning or electrical shock in general causes weird kind of damage. It generally takes strange routes through the body. So you may have an entry wound, if you'd like, in your shoulder from the lightning, and then a major blowout wound where the lightning found its way through to the earth in your leg. So you kind of want to look through the entire body. We talked about that. We talked about patient assessment. But just because you find one spot that's an injury doesn't mean that's the only spot. You want to check the entire body to see where the lightning went in and where the lightning came out. And realize that lightning probably on its way also went through the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidney, and everywhere else. So this person needs definitive medical care and may suffer from long-term consequences if they don't get that care. So if somebody's hit by lightning and then they, for some other reason, they're like, oh, I'm fine, I'm fine. No, you're not. You were just hit by lightning. You need to go get checked out. Cardiac arrest can still be a threat. That person may feel like they're fine or maybe a little bit out of sorts, but they're okay. That doesn't mean their heart's not going to stop. You need to start moving them to medical care immediately. If somebody's hit by lightning and they're not moving, their eyes are fixed and dilated, they're not breathing, there's no heart rate, there's no blood pressure, they're not dead. Again, kind of just like hypothermia, it's not uncommon or not unheard of for somebody to get hit by lightning, have a pause, a cardiac pause, where their heart stops, their blood pressure goes to zero, they don't breathe, and then they pop out of it, sometimes several minutes later. You can help them in that process and make sure they pop out of it by beginning CPR. So do not presume they're dead just because they appear to be dead. The last form of environmental threat we're going to talk about is altitude illness, which includes acute mountain sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema, and high altitude cerebral edema. So I want to talk about both of those very briefly, but first I want to point out that these typically happen somewhere above 6,000 to 8,000 feet. So if you're going to go out to the Rockies, or if you're going out to the Sierras, and you're going to be at high altitude, you need to allow yourself time to acclimate to that high altitude before you start your hike. And the solution for all of these, the number one solution, the most desirable solution, is drop in altitude, descend back down. So don't be obnoxious, don't be stubborn and say, I'll be fine, I just need a little time to get used to it. You are suffering a severe and possibly life-threatening illness. You need to get down in altitude. Okay, acute mountain sickness basically happens at somewhere around 6,500 to 8,000 feet. Signs will be things like fatigue, headache, loss of normal appetite, nausea. The solution is to go down in altitude. Now you might think, oh, I'm in great shape, and so I'm not going to get this altitude sickness. That may not be enough. It turns out that actually physical conditioning isn't a way to deal with acute mountain sickness. Some people are just more prone toward it. There's some genetic predispositions toward it. So it's not the case that just because you're in great shape, you're not going to feel the effects. I already talked about this a little bit when I talked about the circulatory and respiratory system. You might have remembered this, but whenever I think of AMS, I think about the first day of hiking when I would take students out from Stockton and we go into the Rockies. We'd go someplace like, I don't know, near Boulder, and we go for like a modest hike. And after like, I don't know, a quarter mile, people that are in great shape are like breathing heavy and unable to keep up. And they're shocked. They shouldn't be shocked. They're at like 8,000 feet and they're going to feel the effects of the thin air. You need to give yourself some time to acclimate. So just take it easy and slow down. The next two illnesses are much more severe. High altitude cerebral edema can be very serious. Basically, cerebral edema is your brain and edema is swelling. So basically, you've got fluid building up in your cranium. That's not a good thing. It can result in death. How do you know this is happening? Well, you're going to see loss of coordination, what I called before ataxia. Remember this? So maybe the person loses balance, loses motor skill, etc., and they'll be able to walk straight or maybe stand up. One thing you can do is the drunk test. We talked about this before, right? Have them walk a straight line, toe to heel, forward and backward with their eyes closed. Normal person should be able to do that. If they're not able to do that, that's a bad sign. A severe headache, and when they rest and allow themselves time to acclimate, is not getting better. That's a serious sign as well. If you go, I don't know, out to Denver and you spend the first night in a hotel and you're going out hiking the next day and somebody's got a severe headache and they sleep at night and they wake up the next day and they still got a severe headache, you need to descend in altitude. Don't be a fool. You are not going to be able to acclimate to this. You need to descend in altitude. This is a medical condition. Am I making my point? I hope so. So many people ignore this and then they end up in a really serious situation. So you want to avoid that. The possible outcome of this, by the way, is seizures and coma and death. And those are three things that I prefer to avoid. Okay, the other possibility is high altitude pulmonary edema, and you know that this is fluid buildup in your lungs. So some of the first signs of this are going to be a dry cough that then changes into a productive cough, pink sputum, we talked about this before. Possibly there'll be chest pains, but don't rely on those chest pains as a diagnostic tool because they may not manifest. But if you're getting productive pink frothy sputum after arriving at a place at altitude, that is a problem. And that needs to be addressed. The way to address that is to descend. If you can't descend, you can certainly help manage that patient's body temperature, treat for shock. If you have oxygen, you could administer oxygen. One thing you can do is a hyperbaric chamber. So in some high altitude exploration, they will bring portable hyperbaric chambers. And in some high altitude tourist destinations, there are hyperbaric chambers available in the hospital. So if you were in Denver and you start having these serious effects, the pink sputum, etc., and you went to an emergency room, they would have a hyperbaric chamber available for you. Basically, what they're doing then is they put you in this chamber, they pressurize the chamber, and they are descending you, but without the descent. Basically, they're moving you into a condition of higher atmospheric pressure, but without the descent. If you're in Denver and you're suffering from this, and Denver's only at about 6,000 feet, so it's actually unlikely to happen in Denver. But if you're at a high altitude and you're suffering from these effects, should you say, oh, let me drive around and try to find a hyperbaric chamber? No, you should descend in altitude. Don't delay to the descent in altitude to find the hyperbaric chamber. You can always reascend, go back in steps, allowing your body to acclimate. Go down to like 5,000 feet, allow your body to acclimate to 5,000 feet, go to 6,000 or 7,000 feet, allow your body to acclimate. And within a couple of days, you'll be at your 8,000 foot mark and able to do your hike. You just need to allow the body time to figure it out. Okay, in all these environmental scenarios, what are some common themes? One, your skill as a first aid professional is to identify the problem early on and recognize the severity of the threat. Others won't. You will need to assert your authority as the first aid expert and say, look, this is serious. Let me explain this to you. We need to deal with this. It's a medical emergency. This isn't just a passing problem. The person in all these scenarios, hypothermia, hyperthermia, everything we've talked about, right? Burns, etc., may have impaired reasoning, which means you're going to need to be the rational, proactive actor and take action to resolve what could be life-threatening scenarios. These are the kind of things that sneak up on you, and people aren't always convinced initially that they are life-threatening. You need to make sure they understand that they are. Okay, that's it for this video.